Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a really fascinating deep dive into a source document that thoroughly analyzes the secret rapture doctrine and its historical timeline. If you've been following eschatology for a while, you know this is a huge topic. We're going to use the detailed analysis from our source text to unpack exactly how this doctrine developed, how it interprets biblical prophecy, and why this specific document argues for a vastly different perspective. It's going to be incredibly insightful, so let's get right into it.
Okay, let's just briefly look at our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the origins of the secret rapture, the Daniel 9 prophecy, the prophetic clock gap, the idea of a temporary church dispensation, the substitute kingdom claim, and we'll wrap up with the continuous timeline.
Starting right off with Section 1, Origins of the Secret Rapture.
To really understand this, we actually have to step back and look at history. Now, one of the main points the source text hammers home is that the doctrine of a two-phase secret rapture, it just wasn't always in place. For nearly 1,800 years, major reformers saw the Second Coming as a single event where literally every eye would see it. So where did the modern version come from? Well, the text traces it directly back to John Nelson Darby, who brought it into the church around 1830. And context here is absolutely crucial. The source points out that the period from 1830 to 1880 was basically an era where several other new religious cults were being established. You look at the timeline, and you've got Margaret MacDonald having a transvision in 1830 about a two-phase return. You've got Edward Irving translating a book promoting similar ideas, and then Darby steps in and really systemizes it.
And the source text emphasizes that this isn't just some wild accusation from critics. Even the Plymouth Brethren themselves, the very movement Darby pioneered, openly admit this. The quote here says they acknowledge that doctrines like the pre-tribulational rapture were first discovered post-1830 AD. The document makes a really strong point here, that building a foundational doctrine on a 19th century vision, rather than historical biblical exegesis, is highly problematic.
Let's move to Section 2, the Daniel 9 prophecy. Let's see how this all builds, because the theory heavily relies on a specific interpretation of the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9. The source text actually breaks down the original Hebrew for us, which is super helpful. The word for week is Shabuah, translating to a week of years, but it derives from Shaba, meaning to swear or make an oath. So mathematically, we're looking at 490 consecutive years, but fundamentally, it's tied to an eternal covenant, an oath from the Creator. The source argues this was always intended to be one continuous, unbroken block of 490 years. Which brings us to Section 3, the prophetic clock gap. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it visualizes the exact detour that premillennialism takes. The source text uses this chart to highlight what they see as a massive error. Look right there after week 69. According to the doctrine, the prophetic clock just stops. Premillennialism literally interrupts the timeline, creating a huge gap, and they push that final 70th week all the way into the future. And they assign that future week to a physical Antichrist appearing on Earth rather than to the Messiah.
So, the big question the source wants us to ask is, did the prophetic clock really stop? Does it make any logical sense that a mathematically precise countdown to an eternal covenant would just hit pause for 2,000 years? The source document's answer is a resounding no, arguing that this totally breaks the scripture.
Moving right along to Section 4, a temporary church dispensation?
So if there's this massive gap in the timeline, what exactly fills it? According to the premillennial view on the left, this gap is filled by the dispensation of the church, which they claim was an unrevealed mystery to the prophets. They view this as a temporary period, running parallel to a physical Israel, keeping them distinct to make room for a physical Israel in the future. But look at the right side. The source text completely pushes back on this. They argue there are no prophecies for a temporary church period. Because the church isn't a parenthesis, it's the intended new Israel. It's a spiritual congregation of nations prophesied from the very beginning.
This perfectly sets up Section 5, the substitute kingdom claim.
So the crucial point the source makes here is about the profound theological implications of this gap theory. According to the text, premillennialism essentially treats the church as an added afterthought, a temporary substitute. The source points out that this implies the Messiah literally could not establish his kingdom when he came, as if he didn't know the rejection was going to happen, so he had to implement the church age as some sort of temporary backup plan. Our source text firmly calls this out as a complete denial of Scripture, arguing the kingdom is a current, spiritual reality, not a postponed earthly one.
And finally, Section 6, the continuous timeline.
And this brilliantly illustrates the source's counter-argument. If there's no gap and no temporary backup plan, How should we view the timeline? Exactly like this. Seamless, no pauses. It's 490 consecutive years. You have the 7 weeks, the 62 weeks, and then immediately flowing into the final 70th week. In this model, the final week begins with the Messiah's baptism, and right in the middle, after 3.5 years, the crucifixion happens.
The text makes it absolutely clear the 70th week wasn't bumped into the future. It happened consecutively. The Messiah himself fulfilled it, ratifying the eternal covenant in the midst of that final week, making the old sacrifices cease. The timeline wasn't waiting for an Antichrist. It was gloriously and consecutively fulfilled by the Messiah.
We've covered a ton of ground today looking at how this source document deconstructs the secret rapture doctrine. But as always, the best thing you can do is question and investigate for yourself. The source leaves us with these exact thoughts to ponder. Based on everything we've looked at, is Daniel 9's timeline just one continuous period? Is there only one second coming? Is the kingdom a heavenly reality right now, rather than a paused earthly one? And how does all of this impact our view of the contemporary state of Israel? I really encourage you to reflect on these questions and keep digging into the source material. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer, and keep that curiosity alive.